Hello, I'm Jeff Thielman, President and CEO of the International Institute of New England. Welcome to our town hall webinar, Is Humanitarian Parole Humane? Behind an immigration status that has created uncertainty for forcibly displaced immigrants. This topic is all over the news, and it is impacting communities across New England. The federal government created humanitarian parole to resettle people following large-scale crises. The program gives people fleeing an emergency a temporary period to be in the U.S. It does not guarantee asylum or necessarily a long stay in our country, though our work is about keeping people in the United States for as long as possible and helping them to integrate into our region. This topic is complex, and today we'll do our very best to make it understandable. IINE has served humanitarian parolees for many years. But up until a few years ago, people with this status were a small percentage of our clients. Today, humanitarian parolees represent the fastest growing population we serve at the International Institute. And we serve this population because for more than 100 years, IINE has been a local responder to people coming to New England seeking safety and a new beginning. Today's webinar will focus on humanitarian parolee programs created by the administration of President Biden. More than 1 million humanitarian parolees have been legally admitted to the U.S. since 2021. Those admitted include the most recent arrivals, people from Haiti and Central and South America, Ukrainians who fled the Russian invasion, and Afghans who were evacuated after the Taliban took over Afghanistan in 2021. All these groups have come to the International Institute of New England. Today, you'll hear from our staff about how the humanitarian program has changed, the challenges experienced by people with humanitarian parolee status, and how our staff serves individuals and families who have this status. One little housekeeping matter, please use the question and answer feature to ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them all in the second half of the program. Let's talk a little bit about our mission. It's always good to center ourselves in what we're all about. Our mission is to create opportunities for immigrants and refugees to succeed through resettlement, education, career advancement, and pathways to citizenship. We'll be talking a lot about the fourth area of our mission statement, pathways to citizenship, otherwise known as immigration legal services. We have offices in Boston, Lowell, and Manchester, New Hampshire. We actually have 5 physical offices now. Our unaccompanied children program, which covers all of New England, has grown and now has an office in New York City. We do not do our work alone. We partner with healthcare centers, school districts, employers, and community organizations across the region to ensure new arrivals to our country receive all the services they need. Meeting this moment facing New England and the country is exactly what this organization was established to do. Our theory of change is designed for a special immigrant population, those who have been persecuted and displaced and then admitted to the U.S. with a legal humanitarian status. We resettle refugees and immigrants, stabilize them, and then help them integrate into communities throughout New England. Clients enter and re-enter the continuum you see at various points in their journey in the United States. And our overall goal is to help people become self-sufficient as quickly as possible. Tonight, you'll hear from some IINE leaders on this topic, including our Senior Vice President and Chief Advancement Officer, Zan Weber, who will talk about how humanitarian parole has evolved and shaped the immigration landscape in the United States. Our Senior Director of Immigration and Legal Services, Chiara St. Pierre, and the attorney from our Mobile Shelter Services team, Paige, who works in emergency shelters across the state, will share details of our legal services work and answer your questions. At the end of the program, Zan will talk about ways you can get involved. Now I want to turn over to my colleague, Zan Weber, our Chief Advancement Officer and Senior Vice President.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a lot of people on our webinar today, and we are so grateful. As Jeff said, this is a really complex topic, and I'm just going to begin by setting the context for our discussion today. As we continue to share with our Massachusetts and New Hampshire communities, we are barely able to keep up with the huge increase for IINE services. Over the past 3 years alone, we have grown 4 times our size. And this year, we're on track to respond to the needs of 20,000 newly arrived refugees and immigrants. But this isn't because there's suddenly 4 times the number of immigrants in our communities. It's because of the combination of the increase in newly arrived families and the increase in their desperation because they're struggling to take care of themselves. This is in part due to the immigration status the U.S. is turning to more and more when admitting people to the United States. There are numerous legal statuses that may grant an individual the ability to come to the U.S., and each dictates the amount of support, resources, and opportunities a person or a family will have upon arrival, as well as how long they'll be able to remain here with us. And as Jeff noted, many thousands of immigrants recently have entered the country with humanitarian parole status. So I will begin by answering the question we hear repeatedly these days: what is humanitarian parole? As Jeff mentioned, humanitarian parole is a discretionary grant of temporary permission to enter the U.S. for urgent humanitarian or significant health benefit reasons. Historically, it's allowed individuals who are otherwise inadmissible, not allowed into the U.S., to enter the country for a limited period of time due to urgent humanitarian reasons. The factors that we weigh in granting humanitarian parole include the time pressure on an individual, the effect the circumstances are having on the individual's well-being and welfare, and the level of suffering a rejection for support would create for the applicant. In recent years, however, the use of humanitarian parole to admit people to the U.S. has changed. But before we can dive into the use and the impact of humanitarian parole today, I think it's helpful to begin with its initial conception. So back in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act was enacted, and part of this act, humanitarian parole as a status was created. This goal was to create an expedited immigration pathway for temporary emergency needs. This includes individuals who at that time needed to come to the U.S. to receive medical treatment, to visit a sick family member, to attend a family member's funeral, to serve as an organ donor, very temporary reasons to stay. In the years that followed, the program would also be used to support specific populations during times of crises, such as the Filipino World War II Veterans Parole Program. So it's important to remember that no matter the reason the individual is granted parole status, it is always temporary. So moving forward to today, in recent years, instead of granting refugee status or asylum to populations suffering persecution due to violence, political affiliation, other forms of severe discrimination that result in their denial or infringement of their fundamental rights, the U.S. has turned to the humanitarian parole program to grant groups lawful entry. This is very much a change for us and our services, as we're used to serving refugees who have the ability to stay in the U.S. once they've arrived. Over the past few years, the Biden administration has created 3 different humanitarian parole programs for specific populations. The first, in 2021, the U.S. granted humanitarian parole to 100,000 Afghans evacuated from Kabul after the Taliban takeover. In 2022, the U.S. offered humanitarian parole to 117,000 Ukrainians escaping Russian invasion via the United for Ukraine program. And then at the beginning of 2023, the U.S. opened a humanitarian parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, simply called the CHNV program. Since opening, more than 350,000 people have entered through the program over the last 15 months alone, fleeing political instability, widespread gang violence, famine, natural disasters in their home country. The use of the humanitarian parole status has become increasingly widespread And for us, that is an issue for many reasons. The use of humanitarian parole has significant and unfortunately numerous shortcomings. First, this temporary tool of last resort, as it is frequently referred to, is used with populations who instead need desperately a permanent and long-term solution. For Afghans, for Ukrainians, for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, the crises in their home countries are not improving. Returning home is not a safe or a viable option. These families need a home where they can stay. However, as humanitarian parolees, they're not able to pursue lawful permanent residency in the US or citizenship. Instead, they're stuck in an endless loop of uncertainty, reapplying for reparole if that's available, or pursuing other more permanent immigration statuses and benefits like asylum, which is never guaranteed approval. Second, unlike individuals admitted to the US as refugees, parolees don't come here with the right to work, despite the vast majority being of working age and eager to enter our workforce. Every person has to apply for their own employment authorization document, which can take months after arrival to receive. In the meanwhile, many parolees are unable to support themselves and their families. If they were able to work as soon as they got to the US, they could more easily achieve housing stability and could take care of themselves right from the start. Third, other immigration statuses allow individuals to apply for their family members to join them in the US. That is not the case with humanitarian parole. Individuals often have to leave their family members behind, not knowing whether they'll have the means or the opportunity to bring them to safety or even see them again. And finally, the approval process for humanitarian parole is highly discretionary. While being granted parole is meant to be a more efficient route to entering the US legally, it is still a multi-step and highly vetted process. The application process also has inconsistent outcomes, given that each case is individually assessed by the US Customs and Immigration Services. Denials leave individuals and families in dangerous conditions with limited and uncertain paths forward. So, with all of this, what are we doing to help? With the influx of humanitarian parolees into the US, IINE has expanded its legal team in recent years from 4 staff members to today 12 people. You'll now hear from 2 of our legal staff members, our Senior Director of Immigration Legal Services, Chiara St. Pierre, and our attorney, Paige. Casey and Chiara are going to share the details of how we're supporting humanitarian parolees.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Last year, our legal team represented over 2,500 clients. These clients came to us with various immigration statuses, and approximately 25% were parolees. We work with humanitarian parolees within the legal program to apply for their employment authorization document, or EAD card, pursue any other immigration benefit that may be available to them, including but not limited to applying for temporary protected status, or TPS. Temporary protected status is a designation by the Secretary of Homeland Security that designates a country due to conditions being, excuse me, due to conditions there being harmful. Ongoing conflict or environmental disasters can be reasons, or other extraordinary temporary conditions that warrant a designation for TPS. Like parole, TPS is temporary. We also help people to apply for reparole, which is a fairly new process. It has been announced for Afghans and Ukrainians so far. This allows folks who initially entered the US with parole to apply for an extension of their parole period if they're unable to return home due to ongoing country conditions. Currently, there is no formal reparole process in place for CHNV individuals, but they may apply individually, and their cases will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. As Dan mentioned previously, it is highly discretionary at USCIS. We can also assist parolees that are eligible for a green card with that process. For instance, if somebody has an immediate relative in the United States that is a US citizen and can sponsor them, we can help them with that process. We're also assisting Cubans specifically with the Cuban Adjustment Act, which is available for them. That allows certain Cubans to apply for a green card. And finally, while IINE does not offer asylum services, we do have a vast referral network, and folks can always apply for asylum if their circumstances warrant it. And we will refer folks out for asylum assistance. Casey's going to talk to you now about our mobile shelter services team.
Hi, yeah, I'm Casey. I'm part of the new mobile team at IINE that works directly in the emergency shelter system here in Massachusetts. Since the start of our fiscal year, we've served around 900 or more individual clients in the shelter. The work is very similar to what Chiara described, just in a different setting. We help families who are living in shelter navigate the complex immigration situation that they may find themselves in, obtain employment authorization, and apply for any other immigration benefit for which they are eligible. Unlike humanitarian parolees who apply for their program prior to coming to the U.S., the families we're serving in shelter are often paroled into the U.S. Entirely at the discretion of the interviewing officer at the land border. Depending on when they arrived, some folks were only given 90 days of parole, while others were granted parole for up to 1 to 2 years. Currently, there's no possibility of renewing or extending this parole that has been granted by the Border Patrol officer. And after time runs out, they will need to have some other way to maintain lawful status or risk negative immigration consequences. These families, by and large, have fled to the U.S. due to fear of persecution or death if they were to return to their home countries. They have nowhere else to go, and they don't have sponsors or any other familial support in the area. Their situations are dire, and their options for lawfully remaining in the U.S. are extremely limited. Most families in the shelter are recent arrivals, so they currently do not qualify for temporary protected status, which Chiara just talked about. However, Haitian TPS, which some families currently qualify for, does provide some additional benefits beyond parole. Currently, Haitian TPS is set to expire on August 4th, and the current administration has been silent about whether it is going to extend or redesignate Haitian TPS. While it's not a permanent solution, I hope the administration uses this tool to offer additional security to recent arrivals soon, as that would be a great help. I believe Zan is coming up next, and we'll talk about other ways that you can help.
Thank you, Casey and Chiara. I'm always floored by how much uncertainty families and individuals live with as they're here. And because immigration law is such a complex topic, I think we're going to turn the rest of the presentation and program over to the Q&A and answer any questions that you have. So for everyone in the audience, if you could submit questions at any point using the Q&A button, we will try to get to everybody. And we do have a first question. I think this may be for Chiara. Chiara, why has the use of humanitarian parole increased?
Sure, great question. To be honest, it's a political decision. The executive office has broad discretionary authority under the Immigration and Nationality Act, both to enforce immigration laws and decide how to enforce them. And parole, is one of those things. So it is largely a political decision. And they started, in 2021 with the evacuees from Kabul to the United States. All of those individuals had to apply for a more permanent status here in the United States. They can't remain on parole indefinitely. So I think the most simple answer to that question is it's a political decision. It's something that I think we all agree is better than nothing, but maybe could be more also.
Got it. I guess that sort of begs the question, maybe Casey, you could answer this one. Despite having been able to be admitted to the US legally, if humanitarian parole has so many shortcomings, why don't people, once they're here or before they're here, just apply for asylum instead?
So the decision to apply for asylum is really dependent on a person's situation and circumstances. Asylum is meant to be a tool for individuals who are being persecuted themselves because they are part of a group. It's not really meant to be, and is not really effective as a tool for widespread humanitarian crises that affect everybody in a country. You know, that isn't typically a method for asylum, although there are, of course, some exceptions. So not everybody can just file for asylum. And it also comes with certain risks that not everybody should have to face in order to be on a lawful pathway in the United States. There are other ways we could, as a country, decide to do this.
Right. Chiara, once somebody is admitted with humanitarian parole status, how does that, I know we talked about it briefly a little earlier, how does that affect their employment status in the US?
Absolutely. Great question. So again, it's important to remember that humanitarian parole is a temporary status. Many folks who are paroled in do have the ability to apply for an employment authorization document, or EAD card, as it is commonly referred to, once they're here. That process can take several months though, and those months are critical. If you arrive here with nothing and you're of working age, you have skills, you have transferable skills and are able to work, that can be absolutely brutal, especially if you have your family here. The ability to work is critical. So that is a huge challenge. The other issue with employment authorization and employee and parolees rather is the temporary nature of this status. We are starting to see it now with Afghan clients, Ukrainian clients who the government has announced re-parole processes for them, but because of the timing, because of how long USCIS is taking to process, many of these individuals are going to face gaps in employment, meaning their current EAD card is going to expire before their new EAD card is issued. And this is through no fault of their own. It's simply the way the process has been rolled out. It's extremely challenging to navigate for individuals, especially those who might not have the assistance of an attorney. And it's something that we're challenged to navigate as well, as it's a brand new process. But that gap in employment it can be devastating, especially if somebody's gainfully employed and they risk losing their job because of the way the system is set up. So those are the biggest challenges. Other smaller things, logistics, the mail is sometimes unreliable. Folks sometimes have housing instability and their addresses change. And even though they might keep it updated with USCIS, it could still sometimes be mailed to the wrong place. Tracking down those last EADs can take time, take a lot of resources. So there's many challenges with obtaining, employment authorization in the long term.
Wow, it's crazy to think that that level of sort of access comes in the mail, which is, yeah, a challenge. I guess this question is for either of you. If there's so many shortcomings in the program, if the US is not creating more permanent pathways for people, and as we constantly hear on some news channels, if the country's so overwhelmed by the number of people coming here, wouldn't it make more sense, as we often get this question, to shut the borders?
I can start
Sure.
and I'll pass the baton to Casey afterwards. I think the issue is that we need better systems in place. We have the ability to welcome these individuals. The US has historically built our nation welcoming immigrants, and they're blended into the tapestry of our society, into our economy, and we have the ability to do so. So yes, it's overwhelming now because we're in a very reactive state, it seems like. And if there was a little more thoughtfulness, if some of these programs were fleshed out a bit more, I think we could ultimately make it much better. I know that there's a employment shortage here in Massachusetts for certain jobs, and many of these folks can fill those jobs, and that would be huge for our economy. Casey, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, we have so many systems here in the US that are designed for people to succeed, but we make it really, really difficult to access them for immigrants and recent arrivals in these temporary statuses, whether that be temporary protected status, humanitarian parole, or some other quasi-statuses. And the administration has shown its willingness to extend easier pathways for certain groups of individuals, proving they have the power and ability to do it. It's just a question of, are we able to advocate for these programs, and is the government willing to move forward on them? The administration has been a little vague on what the plan is. It's a hot button issue, but at the end of the day, America does better with a more diverse group of people coming in who are willing to work. There are labor shortages throughout the country. And this is one of those things that benefits the American people. And that is what the immigration system is for. We allow family immigration to benefit families. We allow employment-based immigration to benefit US employers. And we allow humanitarian immigration to benefit US society as a whole, because we are better with these people here. Because if they have nowhere else to go, I don't know, it doesn't feel right to me to turn them away. It doesn't feel American to me. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you. I guess I just go into the extreme of that question of, would we close the borders? What would happen to everyone who's here on humanitarian parole if Trump is reelected in November? I don't know, Chiara, if you want to take that one.
Sure. We touched on it earlier in the presentation that the executive office, the president, has broad discretionary authority to enforce immigration laws and to choose how to enforce the laws that are already codified, the regulations and our regulatory. So I think that the Trump administration in his first term showed what they were willing to do. And I think the possibility of reelection creates a lot of fear for the folks in this temporary status, a lot of unknowns. In theory, these parole programs could be shut down completely, and there could be no option to re-parole individuals, and they'd be forced to find another immigration benefit that they could utilize in order to stay here long term. Many of them are doing that anyways because it's simply not safe, or they don't have the option to return home. But that fear of another Trump presidency, people bring it up to us every single day. They're very, very scared about what that would mean for them. And ultimately, changing these policies isn't going to help anyone in the long run. Truly, we need much broader, large-scale, high-level immigration reform. Some of these laws have not been changed since they were enacted, and I think it's a daunting task, but it's something that would make a huge difference for these systems. And as Casey mentioned, for families impacted by it, for employers impacted by it. It's not just, the migrant crisis that's happening now. Immigrants are throughout our entire society, and our society is better for it. You could see it with innovation. You can see what happened under Trump's presidency previously. Many employers moved to Canada who, in response to Trump kind of closing our borders, opened themselves up. And we lost a lot of international students who brought their skills and talents and expertise abroad. So I think it's a really scary thought. I think a lot of individuals are very nervous about that. And it is very possible that these parole programs would be shut down unless there is comprehensive immigration reform.
Wow. It's hard to think about a million lives just in this one category of status being at risk. Casey, is there anything people listening tonight can do to help? Is there more we could offer them?
As always, you can reach out to your congressmen and senators in support of any legislation that will benefit the U.S. Immigrant population. The Afghan Adjustment Act is fighting its way through. As I mentioned before, TPS for certain countries gets renewed. Usually, the government doesn't re-extend that program out to new arrivals. But it has shown a tendency recently with Burma and in previously with Venezuela, of re-extending that benefit to people who had come after the initial designation. And that would be a great way to help. And if you let your representatives know that you support these types of programs, it could happen. It could push the needle.
I think that's an important point, that people do have the opportunity to elect representatives, and as Jeff always saying, elections matter, but also to let them know how they feel. Okay, I have another question. Mary in the audience asked, I have sponsored my friend from Haiti as a humanitarian parolee. He has lived with us since last June. He will soon move into his own apartment. How should he apply for asylum status or a green card?
Sure. So we obviously can't give individualized case advice here, but the answer is always sooner rather than later. Parole for Haitians coming under the CHNB program is generally issued for 2 years. So I'm guessing he was afforded 2 years in parole status, and he would want to apply for something before that expires, especially since reparole has not yet been announced for that category of humanitarian parolees. So anything with immigration, sooner is always better than later.
Right. Okay, next question. To clarify on your help with Cubans, do you help with adjustment of status after folks have been in the US for 1 year?
I could take that one as well. I believe this individual is referring to the Cuban Adjustment Act, and that is exactly what we would do.
Okay, great. What advocacy efforts are underway to address the larger issues leading to the challenges families and individuals are facing? Jeff, you want to jump back in? I could also take this.
Sure, I can jump back in.
Great.
I mean, at the International Institute of New England, we've been leading the lobbying effort across the state to try to get funding for resettlement agencies to serve people who have humanitarian parole and are living in shelters. So we have a contract to exit families from shelters with the state and place them in housing. And there's a conversation right now going on about the supplemental budget at the state level, and we're right in the middle of that discussion between the House and the Senate. And so we're right in the middle of it at the state level. At the federal level, we advocate as well, and that's a much more complicated situation.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll just add, we definitely feel like it's our responsibility to use our voice with all of our legislatures to help them understand what we see on the ground every day and what this uncertainty means for so many families. Okay, our next question is very technical. What is a master hearing, and should an individual have legal representation?
Yeah, I think I'll take this one. A master hearing is the immigration court equivalent to an arraignment. So when you go into a criminal arraignment and the judge asks you, are you guilty or not guilty? In a master hearing, an immigration judge is asking you, are you deportable or are you not deportable? And so if you can afford legal representation, you should always have legal representation when dealing with judges, no matter immigration court, family court, probate court, whatever it is. But the reality is not everybody can afford an attorney for every sort of hearing. Whether you need an attorney at a master hearing really depends on your situation. It depends on the documents. That is not something I can really give individualized answers to over here, but generally that's the answer for what a master hearing is. I would always recommend having legal representation if you can afford some.
Okay, next question. What is being done to change the system so people can stay longer, work, or enter under other systems, maybe other pathways? I think you mentioned the Afghan Adjustment Act, but yeah, do you have other thoughts?
So I think this goes back to advocacy. It's a tool that can be used by the masses. There are some things fighting their way through Congress, the Afghan Adjustment Act being one. Just for the audience, the Afghan Adjustment Act is a proposal that the Afghans evacuated from Kabul in 2021, brought to the United States, be afforded the opportunity to apply directly for a green card from their parole status instead of having to navigate the asylum system or a special immigrant visa or some of the other pathways that are available to them. And it's a really great example of a much cleaner, faster, more efficient route to permanency for folks that are already here. So advocacy, calling your representatives, calling your senators, asking them to support these acts that are going through Congress. That's the biggest way to hopefully try to change the system. But, you know, ultimately in the United States, we really do need comprehensive immigration reform. We need somebody to come in and really look at the IINA, which is the controlling law, and really update it to match our society here today.
Thank you. Either of you could take this. What are some of the key differences between TPS and Biden's humanitarian parole program?
I'll try and tackle this one a little bit. TPS is a program that has been around a lot longer. And so it's a bit more clear what that quasi status provides people. It does give you protection from removal, which means if you do wind up going to one of these master calendar hearings and the judge asks, are you removable or are you deportable? The answer is no, I am not removable. I have temporary protected status. So parole and anything under the Biden humanitarian parole programs does not give you that same benefit. You cannot use it as a defense in immigration court. So that, I think, for me is probably the key difference. The other thing is that it's automatically renewed most of the time, but it is temporary. It will end one day, and at some point, you need to have a permanent solution. So it's not the end-all be-all of problems, which most administrations have been using as the solution. Oh, we'll just throw people into TPS and let them be there. You know, there are people who have been in TPS for El Salvador since the 1990s who still are looking for ways of permanent residency here in the United States, who have been here lawfully living and working in our communities for 30 years. It's still a temporary program. It could still end if the administration changes its mind on the entire program. So.
Thank you.
To add just a little bit to it, since we're talking about these two different programs, another important note, I think, for everybody who is on this call is that TPS and parole can run concurrently at the same time. And in fact, as attorneys, that's often our advice. You want every arrow in your quiver. So if you have the option to be on two temporary statuses at the same time, you want to do that in case reparole isn't an option, or in case the TPS designation expires and isn't renewed or isn't redesignated. So that adds to the layers and layers and layers of complication here for these folks, especially individuals who have been here for 30 years, like Casey just mentioned, on TPS. So, you know, all of us who practice in the realm of immigration law, it's very common where we have folks that have multiple statuses running concurrently. TPS and parole is a great example in recent years because of all the humanitarian parolees we see coming in. Those who are also eligible for TPS, we're applying for TPS for them as well because we don't know what's going to happen. So it creates kind of a bureaucratic backlog of paperwork too. That is not an efficient use of anybody's time. I think anybody would agree with that. But it is the best way to offer layers of protection to folks and hopefully more long-term in the United States until we can find a more permanent solution. So it just adds to how complicated these issues really are.
Got it. One of the ways to manage some of the uncertainty, but it sounds like a strange way. Okay, let's see, a couple more questions. I work on SNAP, which is the food benefit program. Most Haitians are eligible because of the Cuban Haitian rules. How would the expiration of TPS for Haitians impact them since they typically have prior status?
I can try and answer this a bit with the caveat that I'm not a specialist in SNAP and federally granted benefits programs, and this is not legal advice in any way. My general understanding is that if you run out of some form of lawful status to remain in the United States, you are not eligible for most federal benefits. Meaning if you don't have TPS, which gives you lawful permission to remain in the United States, and you don't have some other concurrently running status in the background, there are many of those that there could be. But if you have no other option and your TPS, runs out, at that point, you may not be eligible for federal programs and federal benefits. But that's my basic understanding.
These are great questions. Another one, when a person is here under humanitarian parole with an EAD card, can they receive social services such as help finding a job or training? And if so, how and where?
I'm going to give a typical lawyer answer here and say it depends. I think the Ukrainians are a great example. Under the Uniting for Ukraine program that was created by the Biden administration in 2022, and Russia attacked Ukraine, those individuals entering under Uniting for Ukraine were eligible to receive services from places like IINE. And that came from a combination of federal funding and state funding that has now expired. We're able to still serve Ukrainians on our legal team, for example, but they might not be eligible for such social services someplace, like IINE. But in general, places like IINE, refugee resettlement agencies, folks that are experts in these social services, yes, generally, yes, they can receive these services. And again, I just mentioned the Ukrainians in particular because it's a great example, again, of the uncertainty of these temporary statuses. For a period of time, they were eligible, and then that ended. And it just creates, again, layers of complications. But in general, places like IINE, refugee resettlement agencies, can assist with things like employment services and other important needs.
Thank you. I'll just also mention, it can be really confusing to understand what you're eligible for, or you're supporting someone new, what they're eligible for. So, calling a resettlement provider, IINE, and making an appointment for an intake can be really helpful, because we'll go through an entire assessment of your status and what it means for your eligibility. Unfortunately, that's just not written in written around in the books you can read. So please give us a call. Okay, next question. What would qualify a humanitarian parolee for asylum status?
I can offer a little bit here. So asylum is generally available to anybody, not just humanitarian parolees, but any foreign national, non-citizen who is inside of the United States, who is afraid to return to their home country due to a fear of persecution, due to an immutable characteristic about themselves that can't be changed. And it would be dangerous for them to, be returned back to that country. So that applies to some humanitarian parolees, and it doesn't apply to some other humanitarian parolees. It's really an individualistic, fact-specific discussion to have with an attorney to further understand how this may or may not apply to you.
Okay, next question. USCIS requests parolees to have a US sponsor. I think they're talking about through the Biden program. How does the sponsor's commitment impact parole approval? Pretty close.
I can take this one. So let me rephrase. The two Biden humanitarian parole programs, Uniting for Ukraine and the CHNV program, do both require a sponsor here in the United States to complete a Form I-134, which is essentially committing to financial sponsorship so that individuals won't become a ward of the government. So it's a requirement. So if you don't have that, you will not be approved under those programs. The Afghans were a little bit different because parole was, I think, in reaction to the evacuation, quite honestly. It wasn't something planned ahead of time. They did not need sponsors. But Uniting for Ukraine, CHNB both require a sponsor here in the US for approval to even apply. So it definitely impacts approvals because it is a requirement. So I think I'll leave it at that. It is a requirement. If you don't have it, you will not be approved.
I think I can answer the next question and you can answer from the legal world, but what is your funding source for serving humanitarian parolees? Like Jeff mentioned, we have the majority of our clients are now humanitarian parolees, and that's because the US has provided that opportunity or pathway for so many people rather than other pathways, or more often. And we have a range of services from case management to ESOL and language services, employment and immigration legal services. And we have almost 200 funding streams across public and private resources to patch together funding for our work. It takes up a lot of our time putting together funding, and we're constantly managing the changes in funding, because just like status can be tied to an administration, the funding that goes with supporting immigrants and refugees can also be tied to political changes and administrations. And we also do a great deal, where my work comes in, of fundraising from private philanthropy to support the almost 20,000 people that we're serving this year. There's just not enough funding in any one of our over 100 contracts to be able to sort of make those services whole. So we really rely on community support. Okay, and I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then I just want to share a little bit more about how people can get involved before we wrap up tonight. All right, so next question. Are there any social platforms that go into detail as to what are the requirements and qualifications to apply for adjustment of status? I guess this means, how do people figure out what you
Sure.
need?
I'm happy to take this to start, and then Casey, please feel free to add if you have anything to add. My advice as an attorney here would be to stay away from social platforms. Start at the USCIS website, uscis.gov. They have a breakdown. It's very basic. It does not go into broad detail, but it is an excellent starting point. And it talks about options for family immigration, employment-based immigration, and humanitarian options. So I would say that is a great place to start. It's a federal website, uscis.gov, United States Citizenship and Immigration Service.
That's great advice. Next, can someone on humanitarian parole obtain an emergency travel authorization document?
I'll take this in typical lawyer fashion. It depends. Foreign nationals may apply for emergency travel documents for emergencies. What qualifies as an emergency and whether it will be acceptable, again, is a really highly fact-specific question. It depends on how you apply for it, which office you're going to, the weather, who knows. Is my general lawyer answer to that. It is possible, but again, it depends.
Okay. Okay, two more questions. If state made funding available for resettlement agencies to serve families in emergency shelter, what would change for these families in terms of services? Jeff? And Casey and Chiara in terms of legal services.
I'll defer to Jeff on this.
Okay.
So the state has made $8 million available to the 8 resettlement agencies across the Commonwealth, and we have a contract to exit 50 families. Each agency has roughly is going to exit 50 families from shelter, but more funding is needed. So the funding only goes so far. It sounds like a lot of money, $8 million, but you know, this is a $1 billion program the state has right now. You're talking about people that need to learn English, and we have people in the shelters that aren't taking English classes, aren't really growing in terms of their English skills. We have people that really can't work until they have secure housing. So we're all the agencies across the Commonwealth are looking for people that could help our clients. So more funding is needed. We're grateful for the funding we have, and right now we're using that to exit people from shelter.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. I'll just add, the state's every day trying to figure this out, and so is the legislature with the administration. We were grateful to be a part of some of the next steps, and we have offered the resettlement model as a efficient, effective model to help support people while they're new, get them into community housing, and sort of get them going in terms of support and living independently. I think it's going to take all of us to make sure that those families get on their feet. And I think there's also a lot of resources that have been dedicated to the situation, and we're just hoping to use them as efficiently, as effectively as possible. I don't think there could be a better investment the Commonwealth makes than in families who desperately want to be with us, want to work here, want to contribute. Okay, so I'm gonna ask the last question, then I'll wrap up. What will happen when the parole program expires within the 2 years? Just the easiest question of the night.
Well, I think it's a good one to end on because it goes back to the problem with these parole programs in that they're temporary in nature. So the honest answer right now for CHNV, for example, is we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe the administration will announce a re-parole process like they did for Afghans and Ukrainians. And then folks who have not been able to, get the process started for another avenue for permanency would be forced to apply for re-parole. We just don't know. And it's this uncertainty that is the exact problem with these parole programs, or one of the problems with these parole programs.
And I'll just ask, is it possible that everything people are setting up now, employers, people are renting to parolees, things just are uncertain for everyone?
Right. And what happens when your immigration status expires? So if your parole period expires and you have not applied for anything else before that expiration date, at that point, you are here without lawful status. So at that point, it is possible you could be placed in removal proceedings, deportation proceedings. That is what could happen in theory, if you haven't sought a more permanent benefit or re-parole isn't made unavailable, unfortunately.
Well, shortcomings indeed. Thank you both so much for your time and all of your amazing information for our audience. And I'm just gonna wrap up now before Jeff says goodbye with a little bit more information around how you can help. I think my broad message is we really rely on you to support us, and that means that we can ensure that we're providing professional, culturally sensitive, and free or very, very low cost legal services. We do that for more than 2,000 people a year, which is just a dent, but an incredible lifeline for those people. So ways you can help is, donate funds. This is the single greatest support that we can receive, because we can use that to resource exactly what we need help with. We have gaps in every single contract that we are awarded, as I said before. This is a QR code on your screen that can lead you, right to our webpage to donate. The federal funding that we receive is very, very restricted, and private philanthropy, which I think we're really grateful for, to be able to share this with the community. The communities that we work with are actually subsidizing these programs and making them whole for the people who are benefiting from them. And more, our work is prioritizing people's very basic needs like food and shelter, not their second and third jobs we might want to help them find, not their highest educational aspirations, but just being able to eat and to find a place to sleep. So your dollars count. The second is donating goods. We have so many people in the refugee program and in the shelter program that we're now moving into communities that have absolutely nothing. They came here with nothing more than the belongings that they could carry in like a suitcase or in a backpack. Often people show up and they don't have shoes. So there's just a really large need for all kinds of goods, everything from larger household items to smaller donations like cutlery. You can find all of that information on our website, and that's the link. And then the third way to help is volunteering. We have really a wonderful volunteer program and team here of volunteer coordinators. And we have opportunities that range in terms of like one-off commitments, all the way to like much longer term integrated support and engagements with us. And finally, we have this very unique opportunity that we created last year that we have done a town hall on and spoken about many times, called our Resettle Together program. And that is a community sponsorship opportunity where we meet and train groups of volunteers to partner with our staff to really deeply dig into the work, welcoming people, supporting them, integrating unique families. And then more information on that is also available on our website. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jeff and just say thank you so much for your time and your interest tonight. And hopefully we've given you some more information, some things to think about, and then also ideas on ways that you can get in touch and help.
Well, I want to thank Zan and Casey and Chiara and our whole team for putting together this webinar, and thank all of you for listening and supporting our work. And by supporting our work, you're supporting about 20,000 immigrants and refugees who need our services over the course of this year. About 14 or 15,000 of those individuals are people with humanitarian parole status. So we appreciate all of you listening in and learning. This is a policy issue for many people. For those of us who work at the International Institute of New England and work directly with clients, it's a personal issue because we know these clients, we know what they go through. Our case specialists outside my door and then our 5 offices across the region are working directly with people who are in need of a great deal of help. And they are under quite a bit of pressure to do the most they can for people in great need. So to us, it's personal, and it's because we care deeply about the thousands of people in our services with humanitarian parole status and those with other statuses as well. So thank you so much for believing in the people we serve, and for believing in our mission, and for supporting the International Institute of New England. Have a good afternoon.